early on, this is going to be recorded. So the good thing about that, is you can go back over this later if that feels right to you, or share it with other people or whatever. Uh, my remarks are about a little under an hour, maybe 55 minutes. And then we'll just open this up for general discussion. I'm really I'm really inspired by all of your presence right now. Yeah, I couldn't ask for a better group of people to be holding these thoughts together with, and that's really what I hope I have to offer right now, is for those of us who are already convinced more or less that something needs to change, and that this issue of indebtedness is profound and difficult. Yeah, these are some of the things that I've come across in other people's work, and things I'm working on to sort of help us drop more deeply into what's at stake, what the issues are that we're really facing, because they're quite profound, I think. I want to make one last comment before I start, which is that my PhD is in philosophy, but I had no intention of studying political economy or working on debt or anything like that in graduate school. It was very much something that happened to me in the course of the way that the financial crisis impacted the academic job market and my life chances, and really just it changed the direction of my personal life as well as my intellectual life. And I've spent basically the last 10 years sort of obsessing over economic anthropology, political economy, and like Devin, I also come at these things very much from a kind of point of view that the discourse of economics is very much bound up with theological discourse and religious ideas, and that's part of what makes it so difficult and so complicated, because we live in a kind of supposedly secular and modern era that's unreligious, and economics is supposed to be sort of the most secular discourse there is. But the more you sort of dig into the core concepts and the core sort of social practices, it feels more and more like you're dealing with religion. That's something that will come up today too. Anyway, I just wanted to say again, I'm so grateful for all of you. I know we have so many other things on our minds, so many other pressures. We're in such a moment of crisis, so there's nothing more valuable ever than our attention. And I hope that these ideas just give us a chance to deepen together around this issue in a way that helps us act in a new way. So why the debt strike is not impossible. In the last week, in response to the unfolding economic crisis triggered by the spread of COVID-19, US leaders have been proposing various stopgap measures to help ordinary people make ends meet and pay bills. These proposals have included giving everyone cash, suspending mortgage payments, and canceling all student debt. It's hard to deny that in the immediate near term, this would be a good thing. Obviously, all of us are worried about how we're going to pay our bills in the months ahead, and most of us are deeply in debt. Who wouldn't like to be handed some cash, let alone have our debts forgiven? But we have to ask some questions. First, where would a cash influx go? Immediately, if not to enrich the coffers of Amazon, Walmart, Netflix, and other online retailers and service providers? More importantly, what difference will it make in the long term for ordinary people to get a cash bailout or even some debt relief in the short term if the creditor classes, the banks and other large-scale investors, retain their power to direct production and consumption and maintain their stranglehold on political possibility? Economic relief means nothing in the long term unless it changes power relations, unless it changes who has the power to decide economic priorities and determine social values. Far from something radical, debt cancellation is one of the most ancient and fundamentally conservative actions that large-scale empires take in order to preserve stability and maintain the status quo. As economist and historian Michael Hudson has been arguing for years now, ancient empires from Sumer to Babylonia routinely engaged in large-scale practices of debt forgiveness in order to prevent societal breakdown. The practice was in no sense intended to change the social status of ordinary people, but to prevent them from revolting and leaving the imperial domain. As Hudson shows in his recent book, And Forgive Them Their Debts, ancient agrarian empires were built around a central temple that acted as a storehouse for basic needs, primarily the seed corn needed to plant each year. The peasants would borrow the seed needed to plant, and then at harvest, they would repay what they had borrowed plus a modest tax on the threshing floor. The surplus would be stored in the temple against the possibility of famine or other crop failures, such as from warfare, and to feed the temple administrative classes who did not farm. The grain surpluses in the temples were counted using silver as a unit of account, but silver was rarely used in transactions except by merchants engaged in specialized long-distance trade. These merchants were part of an aristocracy that was also the administrative class of the empire. They were responsible as well for tax collection throughout the regime. Inevitably, this class of middlemen would use their position to engage in lending practices of their own, offering credit to peasants in need or misfortune who could not borrow further from the imperial treasury. Predatory lending by this creditor oligarchy inevitably led to social instability for several reasons. In the first place, ordinary people would often have to put up their livestock, crop yields, their land, or even their children as collateral for these loans, resulting in the destruction of families and effectively instituting slavery. From the point of view of the empire, this was a disaster, since being in hock to the creditors meant that the peasantry would eventually be unable to pay its taxes to the central treasury, and for fear of losing their land, the peasants would refuse to serve in the military or provide the corvée labor needed for large public works, which was their expected duty to the empire. Starvation, exodus, and revolt would occur and dramatically weaken the states. In view of this situation, all ancient rulers pronounced periodic debt amnesties in order to preserve their power over and against the power of the predatory creditor classes. The debts of ordinary people were forgiven, and people were given the right to return to their ancestral lands, which had often been deeded over to the loan sharks. The debt amnesty did not apply to the creditor or merchant classes. That is, the central treasury did not bail out the loan sharks who had hoped for speculative gains on the backs of the poor and misfortunate peasants. As Hudson argues, the modern world represents a departure from this pattern because debts are kept on the books indefinitely, and state governments and courts of law are almost entirely biased toward the interests of the creditor classes, who are generally identified with that mysterious entity, the financial system, or the so-called global economy, which is in reality the interest of a very small handful of lenders. Hudson argues that Western economies, at least since classical Greece and especially since Rome, but up to and including modern capitalism, have been unstable and liable to periodic collapse precisely because they have refused to engage in the periodic debt amnesties required to preserve social order. Although it may now sound like a radical idea, well, maybe before last week, forgiving the debts of ordinary people, offering a general debt amnesty, even injecting cash directly into the bank accounts of its citizens, would in fact be a fundamentally conservative gesture, designed only to prevent social collapse and to preserve the status quo ante of wealth and power. Poor and working people may receive immediate relief, but their interests and demands will remain ignored, marginalized, and suppressed. One alternative to debt amnesty that could in fact play a role in transforming power relations would be a debt strike. A debt strike would be a collective refusal to service any and all consumer loans, healthcare bills, mortgages, credit card payments, and so on, until and unless our demands are met. Our demands could and would include any number of things subject to deliberation, just as is the case for workplace organizing. But Richard Robbins and Tim DiMuzio have recently suggested a possible outline of a platform that might be a starting point, at least for discussion and debate. And this is a 12-point platform that they proposed in their 2016 book, Debt as Power. You can see on here, there's any number of progressive, post-capitalist kinds of proposals. This is just a sort of, starting point for discussion. But as would be the case in the labor strike, we would have to come up with demands that would be the basis of some kind of negotiation. So you can see those there. The debt strike by itself may not be sufficient to bring in a future different from the capitalist endgame, but it could be a necessary strategy in conjunction with a general strike by workers. Such a strike, as Winter has already told us, would not be easy to organize. It faces a number of logistical and tactical challenges, but it's not impossible to conceive, and we may be at a historical juncture that could give it more traction and possibility. In their book, Robbins and DiMuzio argue that if enough people participated, and that in their work they estimated you would need about 20% of net debtors, it could send shockwaves through the state finance nexus. They estimate that if 20% of net debtors withheld payments for a month, it would be impossible for the credit system, including its punitive arm, to impose penalties or to take other kinds of violent actions in response. And what we're soon to see in this crisis is that withholding payments from the creditor classes was never actually essential to the provisioning and care we need from one another. Such a strike would need to be global and coordinated. It could be done through social media, as other movements have done, but this faces dangers we're all aware of. And we could also face the dangers of foreclosure, repossession, fines, and loss of credit. But given that we're entering a period in which most people will not be able to service their debts for several months or even the foreseeable future, an opening for collective action may be here if we can organize. My own role in this today is to address some of the ideological challenges the debt strike faces. In particular, the morality or the piety that most people have around debt. That is, the belief that most people hold that good people always pay their debts. This belief has extremely deep and complicated roots, and in what follows, I will try to disentangle some of them, following in particular the work of the anthropologist and activist David Graeber on this topic, but drawing as well on my own research and on the work of others like Philip Goodchild, Devin Singh, who's here with us, and Electrostimuli. For me, just to give a sense of the bigger picture for a quick second, the debt strike would be part of a movement beyond economics entirely, as a horizon of social organization, which is what I'm trying to think through in a book project that will also be a free open access seminar through online and Insight. And in that book, which I'm calling For the Remains, I'm going to actually try to argue for the abolition of economics altogether in favor of a social form built around care and restoration. But for now, I want to talk about some of the ideological impediments to the debt strike. And it's a big deal because to strike debt is not just to ask for relief from economic burdens or to demand that more enlightened or more generous individuals come into positions of power, but to reveal and potentially challenge the nature and legitimacy of power itself. And this, of course, is one of the most nearly impossible things for us to imagine. There are at least two, and probably more, central illusions that energize the kind of morality or piety we have around debt. Why do we pay our debts? Well, on the one hand, it's because we think we have to. We have entered into legally binding agreements to repay our loans, our credit lines, and we're afraid of the consequences if we don't. We also think that we should. We believe that good people always pay their debts. But these two ideas are in tremendous tension with one another. They may even be contradictory. If it's something we have to do, then whether or not we should do it doesn't matter. How does morality come into the issue if we're simply paying our debts out of fear? And if we collectively despise the creditors, the loan sharks, vulture capitalists, investment bankers, hedge fund managers, payday lenders, and money lenders in general, as most cultures generally do, why do we think we owe these despicable people our lives in interest payments? In order to see the source of this contradictory belief, we have to pull back the historical camera a little bit. One illusion that drives this confusion is the confusion we have between householders and speculators. Modern economics falsely identifies the interests of speculators and householders. In contemporary parlance, Main Street and Wall Street, if you want to put it that way. But there's a difference between borrowing for speculation and borrowing for householding. Taking loans in order to make money off of money is not the same as borrowing to pay bills or make rent. To have to borrow in order to provision yourself is to be in a state of dependence and need. It is a misfortune. To be able to borrow to make speculative investments is to be independent, autonomous, and in a state of desire. It is to have a fortune with which to speculate. Neoliberal ideology succeeded in part by convincing at least some people, mainly white middle class and working people, to reframe their survival needs as if they were investments, as if being able to eat or pay utility bills or even have a home was something optional, something one could choose to invest in or not, as if getting an education were something one did in order to gain strategic advantage over others, to compete, rather than something done because it's inherently interesting or pleasurable or fulfilling. Even though there is some overlap within a very tiny segment of society in the upper middle class, householders cannot be speculators, and speculators do not need to household because they command the labor of others to household for them. The rest of us are their servants to command. The illusion, however, is that speculators, the owners of massive capitals, are just larger households. The reality, however, is that anyone in a position to speculate on the householding needs of others literally lives in a separate world. For instance, the world inhabited by Donald Trump, who in fact owes more to his creditors than he is worth, but is never prohibited from borrowing more. As the old saying goes, if you owe the bank $100,000, the bank owns you, but if you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. Creditors are not like us, simply wealthier. They are of a different order, a different class. They have access to power, and that access is not based on wealth, ingenuity, or entrepreneurship, but on custom, precedent, political leverage, family membership, and many other contingencies. It is arbitrary, unfair, and dangerous to have a permanent speculative class or a class of creditors at all. The second illusion and perhaps an even deeper one, is the association between indebtedness and guilt. Probably the single most important confusion about debt is that although most modern loans are officially undertaken as the means by which someone gains access to credit, and therefore is able to do something they otherwise would not have the means to do, the archaic meaning of debt as some kind of fault or guilt hangs over what is supposedly a good thing, namely the extension of credit by some human beings to others. Why does being in debt make us feel guilty? We know that one person's debt is another's credit, and that without extending credit to one another as a form of trust and risk-taking, society would be paralyzed. Yet, being in debt is shameful. Why? Well, it's not as simple as shifting perspective. It's not enough just to think about the fact that the debt you are carrying really just is someone's investment in you, so that you should feel happy, confident, or supported when you are given a loan. If it's such a gift of time and resources, why doesn't it feel that way? Besides how difficult it might be to make the repayment schedule, and besides the way neoliberalism has taught each of us that structural and systemic problems in the economy can only be addressed through individual effort and initiative, though our resilience and overcoming perpetually fails, there is another, deeper and older reason for shame around debt. Most human indebtedness, and most debt to this day, exists not because of the fact that some people mysteriously happen to have resources they are willing at a price to let others use. Most debt is a reflection of injury or harm done by one person to another. As Nietzsche famously noticed in German, in almost all Indo-European languages, the word for debt is almost the same as the word for guilt or sinfulness. Why is this? The reason is that the earliest and most common form of debt in human history is not an investment. It's not wealth one is lent in order to produce something new or different in a future one otherwise could not. Rather, the earliest and most widespread form of debt, and indeed anything like money, was not a result of investment, but was a fine or penalty that one person or group owed to another because of an injury, crime, or accident. To be indebted to another, primarily, meant not to be trying to convince someone to invest in your future, but to owe someone a penalty or reparations for something that had gone wrong in the past. Village or tribal elders were given the task of negotiating a settlement between parties that might otherwise resolve conflicts only through violence. If it were a case of murder, one family might even be obliged to pay for the lost life of another family by bonding one of their children over to the injured family as a servant. Some societies were even built around extremely complex systems of pawnship that grew out of this way of settling disputes and keeping the peace by more or less permanently lending family members to one another. Confusion about the morality of debt can be traced to the archaic and persistent role of these kinds of practices in human life. If to be in debt usually meant, in human history, that one had been responsible for injuring or in some way harming another, but had not yet restored one's good name or social standing by repaying or in some way restoring what had been lost or damaged, then in fact to be in debt was to be a bad person. Presumably, a village elder would find an acceptable punishment that would keep the tribe together. If he refused to pay the imposed penalty and thus kept the dispute alive, you were either endangering the life of your group or weakening its membership by leaving. In this sense, anyone who was in debt or remained in debt to others was truly a bad person. To connect this to our day, what is shady or guilt-ridden or pernicious about lending in general is not really the difficulty involved in paying back the creditors. It's in the very existence of a permanent creditor class. And this is what we need to fight against. For in terms of human history and human experience, a permanent creditor class would represent something like a permanently unforgiving party, a party that was presumably injured in some way, but has refused to accept mediation or reconciliation, and has managed through force or persuasion to make others think that they permanently owe tribute, in the form of interest payments, to someone's supposedly besmirched honor. What makes up the power and honor of the prestigious is not that they have something we do not, but that they have the right or the power to tax something that is ours, namely our wealth, energy, time, and talent. As long as there is a segment of society that remains in this position, it is as if there is an alien or parasitic life inside the social body whose interest is in the survival or householding of others rather than their own, and this is an interest of speculation rather than identification. What's shameful about debt is the permanent state of dependency or servitude of an entire segment or group or class of society that is made to feel guilty, creating a dependency that is neither natural nor inevitable, but simply a matter of a felt need for social trust around risk-taking and resource allocation. How did this situation in the modern era arise? The illusion of Adam Smith and the classical political economists was that certain people happened to be in positions to lend to others or to have others work for them, because in some distant past, some people simply saved and others did not. Marx showed decisively the illusion here, which is the illusion that treasure hoards were not, which they are, the result of systemic warfare, violence, plunder, and theft. Everything he called primitive accumulation. On the one hand, it's obvious that the greatest treasures and treasuries in human histories were not generated through hard work or industry or prudence, but through violence, and that most inherited wealth is simply the inheritance of the permanent warfare of some human beings against most others. So the so-called rent that the creditor classes charge others is simply the permanent blood-stained tax on the vanquished by the victors. If that is the case, not only do we not really owe our payments to the creditors classes would in fact owe us massive and perhaps permanent reparations. I will say more about this in a few minutes, but that is effectively what the radicalization of debt amnesty in the form of the Jubilee year would have meant had it ever been instituted completely in Judaism itself. I'll say more about that in a minute. So from this historical point of view, not only should good people not pay their debts, good people should not live in societies where there is anything like a permanent creditor class. That anyway was the message, among others, of Jesus of Nazareth. At minimum, anything like lending, especially lending at interest, should be either state-controlled through public banking with democratic oversight, or if private lending practices persist, those practices should be overseen by publicly accountable boards. That would be, I would think, the most minimal reform imaginable, but I personally want something much more radical than that, which would be the abolition of a creditor class altogether. But to just drop one more step into this, think about how bizarre this situation is. Who have ordinary people offended such that they might feel as if they must continuously clear their good name by always paying their debts? What Maurizio Lazzarato has argued recently is that under neoliberalism, it's as if we've been all made to feel guilty before capital for our very existence. It's as if we owe capital an apology for committing the crime of merely existing. What would that crime be? It would be the sin of simply having needs. We need resources to survive, and we have needs, and we need to engage in many kinds of unproductive activity from the point of view of the market and commodification. To atone for this sin of mere existence, we must agree that we don't actually deserve to live unless we can find a way to be productive and earn a rate of return. It's only by becoming productive beyond our mere existence, productive that is from the point of view the creditor classes, that we are able to household to meet the needs of provisioning and care. But think about how bizarre this is. That means that would make sense only if provisioning and care were themselves some kind of speculative investment, a kind of investment in the future, rather than as a provision of present needs, wants, and desires. At the extreme of this absurdity is the image of a planet and of planetary life that somehow owes a rent to capital for its existence. Only if the planet manages to grow economically at 3% does it retain the right to exist, because only at that rate can it even hope to begin to pay back what it owes to the capitalists. Anything and everything on the planet that does not contribute to 3% growth can or must be destroyed if not converted into what is necessary for production and consumption, whether or not that consuming or producing meets any human or planetary needs for care or self-expression, or even whether such production and consumption are conducive to survival. But the growth imperative, destroying the planet, is maintained only by the need to repay compound interest, to pay tribute to the creditor classes, and that is why I would argue this class must be abolished. And it was, in fact, the abolition of such a class that was at the heart of the apocalyptic tradition in Judaism that gave us the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. As Hudson has shown in his work, the modern Bible is one in which the extant materials, the Torah, were interpolated with stories depicting the consequences for the people of bad rulers, and divine punishment as being called for primarily for the sins of the leadership. The form that oppressive leadership takes in the Bible is depicted over and over again as the oppression and exploitation of the poor by the creditor oligarchies and the monarchs. The reason presented by the Jewish prophets for their exile and suffering was not due to the power of these foreign empires or of their gods over Yahweh, but because the leadership of Israel had failed to govern the people with righteousness. Specifically, they had failed to enforce the debt jubilee and liberate or redeem the people from their bondage to the predatory creditor classes. Jesus of Nazareth got arguably attacked and killed for his insistence on these teachings. In fact, his first sermon was from the prophet that had declared the day of the Lord, which was a stock phrase from the surrounding empires that meant the forgiveness of debts and the right of return of people to their land. If periodic debt cancellation, a jubilee, were made automatic, as it is supposedly in the Mosaic Law, once every 70 years, basically once a generation, this would make debt cancellation no longer a simply conservative or restorative gesture. It wouldn't be just about reordering or restoring the order of a given order of social. It would in fact abolish any kind of economic sovereignty based on the prerogatives of a permanent creditor class. The subversive effect of a unilateral command to forgive debts would be not merely to bring the poor their apportioned slice of the pie, or simply return them to their ancestral lands and inheritance, but it would mean the abolition of any permanent economic hierarchy or social division based on wealth. A debt strike can be one step toward such a permanent jubilee, subverting the very idea of economic order. We are prevented from engaging in care and free creative expression by the demands of the creditors that we adhere to their expectations for production and consumption. We didn't listen to Jesus then, and we're not listening now. Maybe we should start with the debt strike. Thanks.